This is Fam Electric Ghost, and we're live on the air with Sylvia Worsham for the first time. Thank you for being on the Fam Electric Ghost podcast. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing wonderful. I hope you're doing well.
Yeah, we want to. I'm always happy to talk to new people. We've been podcasting for a while, and this episode is actually 920 of the Fam Electric Ghost podcast. We're getting close to our episode 1000. We've been on the air. If you track us on Apple Podcasts since 2016.
Wow.
So, in this episode, we're going to talk about um, a couple of things, but we want to bring, I think this is the topic we wanted to get into is like how to drop the ego to live a life of joy. And then we'll put your website back up, which is your LinkedIn. Um,
Yes, right now it is.
so maybe I want to talk from the beginning is that maybe you could, that's your website,
For now, because it's under
the,
construction.
the, the link. Oh, okay. But you're gonna have like a permanent website later.
Yes.
Okay. So one of the things we like to talk about is like what you actually do, and you're a best-selling author, and you're a turning points coach. And maybe you could tell us like what is a turning points coach?
It's basically a coach that helps you from a turning point to shift the lens of your life towards what you're meant to do. So, from a turning point to your soul identity is what I do. And so, what that means is you are facing a big crossroads right now, let's say divorce. And I'm going to take you from that spot of fear and I'm going to help you journey through fear to the side where joy is waiting and where your soul is waiting to light your path, if you will. So I help you from that point to the identity of your soul, your divine soul's purpose. And so that's what I help guide women do. Women are usually the ones that turn to me and want to work with me. And these are women that are in deep spiritual change. And I help them turn inwards and listen to their intuition instead of the noise of the outside world, which is where a lot of us tend to listen to a great deal of the time. And so
Yeah,
that's what
being
a turning points coach does.
that's interesting because I'm a musician, I'm a podcaster, I'm a producer. I deal with a lot of creative people, and one of the things that happens is like you mentioned like you in your write up that you like to have people become like the best versions of themselves.
Yes.
And when you're a producer, that's kind of like the goal. A
Oh,
producer
yeah.
is like a teacher, right? So if you take like an artist comes to you and they've got their demo, and
Hmm.
sometimes they're like, "Oh, I want to become like this other person," and then
Hmm.
as a producer is like, "I want to take the gems I hear in your demo and make you the best version of yourself." But a lot
Yes.
of artists would like, "Well, I want to be like Billy Joel. I want to be like
Hmm.
Axl Rose. I want to be like Marvin Gaye." It's like what you have uniquely as yourself is like that's your voice. It's you.
Yes.
Nobody else has your voice, and so you have to convince like artists to like present themselves rather than some other version that's actually trying to be somebody that they're never going to match that person.
Ever.
It's actually better to actually take what is uniquely them and
Yes.
show off all the aspects of it and make it sound better. And so
Exactly.
it's almost like as a life coach, you're doing something somewhat similar. I'm trying to find the parallels
Oh,
in
no, and
different
I
things.
actually love that example that you shared because the light inside of each of us is very uniquely ours. We have all been gifted in a very unique way. And when we start living life, unfortunately, we start carrying on all the trauma. We have experiences that are not necessarily great experiences, and we start carrying those on, right? And that becomes our self image or the ego, if you will. And we start projecting from the ego a lot of times of who we are, but that's not who we are. Who we are is our soul identity, which is our light, our unique gifts. And so, as a turning points coach, what I help do, much like a producer helps a singer do, is I help pull out that light and show it to them and say, this is really what you're aiming for. This is the identity you need to be operating from, which is where joy and love and abundance exists and thrive. Right now you're in fear and scarcity, and but we need to journey through the fear and not skip over the fear, because the fear teaches us a great deal about ourselves and about who we want to be, because it provides that contrast to the life that we
Mhm.
crave and we want and we desire. So I actually loved your example. It was really unique, and I thought that was so neat. Yeah, you're right. I'm kind of like the producer as a turning
Well,
point
yeah,
too.
that's the whole thing is a lot of times what you'll find is like artists on stage, they appear very self-confident. They fear there's
Yes.
almost like this other version of themselves, and it's like it's very theatrical, and you're like, "Wow." But you find out, like, after they're off the stage, they're not like that. Most of the
No.
time, they're very like, they can be a very obsessive, very insecure,
Hmm.
needing people to kind of build them up, and it's like, wow, that's almost like a totally different person. And
Yes.
when you're working with them, you see this like other version of themselves. And I was always into poetry. I was into Victorian poetry, and I
Uh-huh.
like the Victorian poets always had this kind of like the looking glass and this idea of the other you, and and being infected by the muse. And I was like always into like Blake and Tennyson and Wordsworth, and the fact that they would have all these layered meanings, but
Hmm.
under it was the truth. And then like
Hmm.
you end up dealing with people and they have these beliefs that they think are truths. And it could be like, oh, my parents never thought I was good enough. And you'd be surprised, like they're still carrying that. And
Of
it's
course
not
they are.
that's not a truth, but that you think it is. And then you have
Well,
to
you
kind of make them unlearn it.
it's true, because you touched on a very good point. It's what they believe about themselves, and limiting beliefs form very early on, and they form after a significant emotional event. So, and we carry those beliefs in us and we project them, and that's who we end up becoming. But that's not who we are. That's not how we weren't born that way. We experience life that way. And so that's why you have a lot of life coaches out there now, because there's a huge necessity for them to help identify those belief systems that are not necessarily helping you thrive at life. They're limiting your amazing capacity as a human being. They're dimming your light, if you will. So our job is to go in there, search for what is at the root of what's causing you to project that self-image that's not necessarily in your best interest, and identify and uproot and shift, right? Because we can always shift that belief. Instead of believing we're not enough, which a lot of people find themselves in, they can shift to I am enough. I'm more than enough, right? And operate from that space, and then start projecting from that space. You start to create an abundant mindset. That's what we call an abundant mindset. But it takes time. It takes time and it takes practice, because it took us time and practice to be negative in our way of thinking. So it's going to take time and practice to deprogram that
Yeah.
negative mindset. That makes sense.
So your story is kind of miraculous in its own sense because you transformed yourself, right? And
Yes.
from being in like the corporate world to being more of a self starter, to like running your own business, going into a different kind of creator space. I
Yeah.
look at like mentors and life coaches. You guys all have creative aspects that are similar to when I talk to authors or poets or you know, people in theater and film and music. Is like it's still that you have to have the creativity to be able to actually have some like a life coach like program or a means of actually helping other people. You have to have that creative spark to like think it out.
Yes. Well, I mean, my creative spark was the Journey to Me book. That was a creative spark, but that was a 15 chapter creative spark. And that came way later. But you're right. I did transform myself from a perfectionist and a high achiever, which that's where I lived and thrived for a long time. Fear was my best friend.
Mhm.
Because you land in prime breeding grounds like sales when you don't feel enough and you're constantly striving for more. I mean, they
Mm,
love people like us, right? These high achievers that just, it's never enough. And so we're going to strive and strive and strive. We're going to sell more and more and more. And so it's ideal for those companies, but it's not ideal for the individual because eventually there will come a time where you're going to burn out. And
yeah.
I burned out so significantly that it nearly killed me in
Wow.
2012. So I don't want that to happen to everybody because that, I got a second chance, but that doesn't mean that the second person might. They may not get a second chance.
A lot of people, feel like they're kind of given these goals in life to be the breadwinner or get these like high achieving numbers, and then you're always going to keep on changing the goalpost. And then like we're told that like the creative arts, well, that's kind of like, well, that doesn't make money. But that, that's not, how could that be satisfying? Because you can't depend on it, right? Because you don't know
Exactly.
what people like. If you're an artist, like it takes a long time to put something together. You have no idea if people are going to like it. You put it
Yeah.
out, and it kind of, you deal with it or you don't. And it's not like, well, I need a defined set of money to pay my mortgage. And so a lot of artists, we have our day jobs, and then we have our like the job that makes us happy, which is the art. And sometimes we hope that the art will take over and we don't have to do the day job, but we find a way to kind of balance. But
Hmm.
I see a lot of people come from a world that's very unbalanced, and they're not really doing what they want. They've kind of been they're doing something they thought they wanted, and they find out they didn't really want to do it.
Yeah. No, no. Totally. Totally. Yeah, it's not for everybody, but certainly if you're happy where you're at, as long as you're happy doing what you're doing, it's great. But when you're not happy, when you're just doing it because other people expect you to do that life, then you're eventually that's you're going to reach a certain threshold, a certain
Hmm.
crossroads, if you will. And then you're going to have a choice to make whether you want to continue this path being miserable in your own ego, self limiting world, or you're going to say, you know what, I want to pivot and I want more joy in my life. I want to be able to enjoy what I'm doing, um, even though it doesn't pay me. A six-figure, seven-figure salary, that's not the most important thing to me. And I think when you go through some of these turning points, it makes you realize that life is so much more than just your paycheck
Yeah.
or anything, or it's more about family and the love in your life, and that's what really creates the richness. And from that perspective, then you can build, and you can start shining that true light, that divine soul's purpose that you were created for, because all of us have a creator inside of us. I mean, we are all creators in our own way, right? You do it through music, I do it through writing, the next person does it through finance, and they have a beautiful way of doing that, and only they can do that, right? We all play a role in this world. But the question I always ask people is, are you are you living out your divine purpose? Is this what you're meant to do for your life? And the answer is no. Then I think it would be beneficial to you to reflect on that and then really start to put into action, um, and those steps to step into uncertainty, step into change. There's so much wisdom and change, I think, that most people miss. That we've already learned a lot of the lessons we're meant to apply now, and some people just never do, and that's why they stay stuck where they're at.
Well, I think you have to be willing to kind of listen. Like, I've always had this poetic idea of like the muse. And,
Hmm.
the podcast came about for me back in 2016 because this guy in New York saw my SoundCloud and he said, "Hey, I want you to be on my podcast.
Oh,
Send me a
cool.
note." Right. And so I said, "Okay, what is that?" It's like an interview. So we did a podcast and then we liked it so much, we did a podcast together for like
Oh,
6 months. And then he couldn't do it anymore. And I said, "Well, you know what? I like this." And it kind of came out of the fact that I was putting myself out there as a musician. A podcaster came to me, brought me in. We found out that we had a synergy. We started doing it, and the thing that allowed it to happen is I didn't put like a limiting belief on myself, saying, "Oh, I can't do that." Oh, and I just said, "Well, that's not on my schedule, so I don't have time to do that." So I made time to actually do it, and then it became, like what it is now. Like it's gone way beyond what but something I hadn't really planned on. And then I was willing to kind of see, oh, I can actually integrate this into a lot of other things I'm doing. It's helped my business, my regular day-to-day job. It's giving me more confidence. It's helped me be a better public speaker. And it wasn't something I actually had it on a life plan, but it ended up fitting into my life plan. But I had to be willing to kind of embrace it when it happened.
Exactly. Yeah. I think you brought up two very good points. One is you were open to it, and that openness allowed you to receive that opportunity and actually act on it, right? Number one. And number two is you didn't limit yourself. You didn't say you couldn't do it. And those are very powerful statements you made that I really want to bring to light, because belief is at the root of who we become. And if our belief is we cannot do what we are meant to do, you will continuously stay exactly where you're at. But I love that you put yourself out there as a musician. I love that you had enough faith in yourself to say, you know, I'm going to put myself out there because it brings me joy, because this is what I'm meant to do. And you attracted the right person into your life that saw that gift and not only said, I see the gift, but let me help you market and help that gift be received by a lot of people so that it blesses them. And I think that's those are two very important points that you made that I just wanted to touch on. I hope that's okay.
No, it's fine because I think it's kind of like a transition from like the corporate world to a more kind of independent world because being an artist, you're kind of like you're your own boss, right? You have to
Mhm.
do all the work. And when you get into podcasting, you're kind of running your own brand. And it kind of like the corporate experience helped me, and I'm still in that world to
Mhm.
understand how why, you see I got a logo, I had a brand, see I'm using like, different tools to actually get out here, different distribution network. So there's a lot of, it's a creative thing, but there's those, these pipelines, there's all these concepts that are like marketing, all these things that are business things. And
Of
an
course.
artist would look at that and go, I don't like that. I don't want to do anything with that. But that's part of like when you become an independent musician, then you have to care about that. You have to care about SEO. You have to care about these things. And then you have to figure out, well, how am I going to do that? And
Mhm.
it starts to, you start to have to learn how to organize. And a lot of
Exactly.
artists was like, I don't want to do that. That's not what they're into. But like at some point you have to take responsibility. Like if you want to be independent, you have to grow into certain things that maybe you're uncomfortable with.
Yes.
And then figure out what you can't do and what somebody else can do. And then you can't do everything. So you figure out like what you're good at and what you're not good at and where you need to ask help. And like you can go to a life coach, go to a mentor, go to an accountant, go to whoever you need that you can't do that thing, but you
Exactly.
still have to have the drive in the first place to even bring that spark out into reality.
You know, it's funny that you talk about drive, because it was something that my husband and I were talking about just today at lunch, the difference between tenacity and passion. And tenacity is that innate, personality trait of that drive that people have, right, to make things happen. But you also need a little bit of passion. And I hear a little bit of passion in your voice of like, yeah, you know what, I have this goal. And sometimes, I got to do things even though I'm not comfortable with them, but because you have a passion and you have a purpose. Your purpose is very, very strong. And when your purpose is strong, it carries you through that process that may not be as comfortable for you, but because if you feel so strongly about what it is that you're doing, it 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 you continue on the path and you make it a reality. Because a lot of people say, they've asked me, how did you get a book out there? A book is a big deal because you got to write the chapters. And then I was telling my husband, I was like, it's not just writing the chapters, it's then the editing process and all the other parts that are not as fun. So I can
Yeah.
understand the artists when they say, well, I've produced my work, right? Like I've written the words and I sing the words, but I don't want to do what, the rest. But like you said, it's your project. And so you have to be intimately involved in the process, whether it's comfortable or not, because ultimately your message needs to be packaged in a way that's going to be well received by those that you're intending to transform with your words, right? So as artists, I think it's important for us to realize that, and when things aren't moving or we're stuck or something, it's to reevaluate why we're doing what we're doing and
Yeah.
to make that stronger in us. When people have asked me, why do you do what you do? I said, because it's God's plan for my life. And when you receive a second chance at life, you kind of feel like you owe it to the guy, who gave you the second chance to really fill out that purpose in a very big way. And that's why I'm out there with my message, day in and day out on podcast interviews and sharing as much value as I can to help others through the journey.
Well, I think, yeah, being, one of the things that empowered me is I went through this kind of crucible moment, like you were alluding to, is like when I was 27, I had a level 3 sarcoma.
Ooh,
And I went through a bunch of treatments, like with my oncologist and stuff, and I beat it. And that was when I was 27 or 55. So I've been cancer
okay.
free since 27. But
Yay.
but it was like that was this thing that made me. There's like the pre-cancer me, and there's the post-cancer me. The pre-cancer me had like certain ceilings I put on myself and things I was scared of doing. That
Mhm.
once I beat cancer, then I was like, why should I be scared of going in front of people and singing a song? Because
Yeah.
I beat cancer. It's like, why should I be scared of trying to do like travel? I lived in Japan for 2 years, and before cancer, I would have never done that. So there, what opened it up was like this kind of less fear, and I still have fear in life, but I had less
Mhm.
fear than what I had because I was willing to do things because, hey, I beat cancer. So I felt like I need to get this stuff out because I kind of got this new lease on life that like I need, to go out there and just not be scared of just being who I was and actualize what I was in my head and make it happen. And you don't have to have that kind of thing happen to you, but sometimes something has to get you to the point where you make the decision where you weren't doing something and now you're doing something.
Yeah, and like you said, it doesn't have to be drastic. You don't want near-death experience because I had a near-death experience just like you're describing, but you don't want that for everybody because, like you said, you and I got second chances, but the next person may not. Depending on how advanced they catch it or not advanced. I mean, anything can happen, right? So, um, but really, anything can be viewed as a turning point. It could just be even a loss of a job that you thought was yours, like a promotion at a corporation. That is a turning point right there because now you have a choice. Do you want to continue on the path that you're on, or do you want to shift, pivot,
Mm,
if you will?
yeah, yeah,
And or you're going through a divorce, or even just you've stepped down from a corporate job into a stay-at-home parent. That's also a transition. That is a very common transition for a lot of parents out there, and it can really cause some havoc there,
oh yeah,
some identity crisis because if you tie your significance to the size of your paycheck and then all of a sudden you don't have a paycheck, what is
yeah.
that going to do to your
It's gonna
work?
deflate your ego big time.
Yeah, it's gonna deflate that belief that you've carried for so long that really isn't serving you anymore. So I think it's really a combination of things in that you have choices. And sometimes we choose to operate from our programming, from our ego or our self-image, and sometimes we choose joy and we say, you know what, I'm going to walk into the uncertain path because that is where I'm being pulled to step into, and I'm going to have faith, and I'm not going to limit myself anymore, and I'm just going to have faith that everything is happening in my favor. And the
But
more you believe it, the more you step in there, and the more the path gets revealed to you at times. And I know it's happened to me. I'm sure it happened to you too. The more you stepped confidently into change, the more the path revealed.
yeah, because I mean, I used to be when I stepped in like different stages. Like after the cancer, I got back into biking to get my health back up. I got into mountain biking, kind of built a frame from my bed, had parts sent to me as I was recovering, and then I went on a trail and built myself back up, and then used that as a way to kind of measure my physical capability of being able to get back on the trail. But then the other piece of it was just, uh, you know, looking at what I wanted to do as an artist and not being scared to go in front of people and show people work. And, even if it was different, it wasn't what's going on. That's kind of hard because a lot of times people are told like, well, you're not Jimmy Page, you're not Jimi
Mhm.
Hendrix, you're not this. So why do you even have a right to do it? Because people think it's like you got to be exceptional to even be an artist, and you can be uniquely yourself. That's one thing I liked about like punk rock with
Mhm.
bands like the Ramones and the Talking Heads and all those bands and CBGBs in New York in the late 70s, early 80s was like you can just go out there and you don't have perfect pitch. You're not singing like Marvin Gaye, but you still have something to say. And
Yeah.
it actually is valid just because you don't have the perfect pitch, you don't have Sinatra's voice, you don't have that, but you have something else. You have this other spark. And so then people started opening up. They're like, well, you can have other types of music. It doesn't have to be this well trained 5 octave voice. It can be something else that maybe has just got a lot of passion. And then he's like, oh, that's legitimate. So yeah, like everything's on the table. So then you can look at like it doesn't have to be one type of thing. That's the idea of it, like expansion in arts and not being limited by what has gone on before, but we're willing to open up to new possibilities.
Yes. Yes, and I think that not giving up is a big factor of it too, because a lot of people will take a no and just shut down. And that goes again with what you believe about yourself, putting those ceilings. But it sounds like you just kept asking. Like, okay, so this door closed, so you went to the next door and the next door, and somebody listened and said, "You know what? You're right. You have something unique." And that's that drive, and that's that passion, that's that purpose. And when that's not in sync, then that's when people just kind of stay comfortable in the darkness in their own space because they're too afraid to step out. I know a I trained under John Maxwell as a coach, and one of the speakers he has is Nick Vujicic, and Nick has no limbs. I don't know if you know who that is or not, but he's a Christian speaker and he's world renowned. And the very first time he called a school, he got 64 rejections.
Mm.
64 schools told him, no, you can't come in and empower children because he was going to he had a bullying message or what have you. And he created his own niche, of speaking,
Hmm.
but he never gave up. He had 64 no's. And I think that's important to tell people out there. It's like just because you got 64 no's, if he had just said, okay, I don't want to do this anymore and just shut down, we would have never known who he was. We would have never received his beautiful message. And we wouldn't have a lot of kids out there believing in themselves, that there is no limits because this guy has done everything with no limbs. Like
Yeah.
none. So it's like the world is full of possibility when you believe it's possible, when you believe it's against life is against you and you're totally focused on that, then that's what you're going to attract in life. So it starts very rudimentary at beliefs, and that's how you can live a life of joy is when you step out there and you keep stepping out there and you keep saying, hey, look at me, I have something to say and I have a unique message because we all do.
Well, I think there's a story from one of the Victorian poets I love the most is like William Blake, and he was not known in his time. Right? He's one of the greatest Victorian poets that actually wasn't known in his time. He was kind of unknown. But what he did is all his poems were etched in metal with artwork. So the songs of innocence and experience that he's famous for were actually found on these metal plates with all this ornate art going with each poem. Each poem actually is like a metal painting. There's all this etching. So he kind of believed, even though he didn't market himself, when he was creating those works, he believed they should be permanent. So he
Hmm.
created a form that was so permanent that when after his death it was found and became famous in our age,
Hmm.
in our time period. And so it's like what happened is that he had that drive to feel like I want this to be permanent. So he made art that go beyond him because it was so permanent. It wasn't just paper; it was these metal etchings. So
That's
it's this
awesome.
idea that you can believe, and that belief you can feel it in his work when you see it.
No, I can feel it right now as you're talking, because it's the energy, right? There's always an energy behind what we do, and you can feel when someone's being sincere and when someone's like faking it. I'm sure you see a lot of that in your
Mhm.
industry, like when people really don't feel what they're singing,
Yeah.
to be true. Uh, Especially even in writing, like when you see how some people write, you're like, you can't relate to them. When there's a certain vulnerability to it, you can relate almost immediately because we're human, right? We're emotional
Yeah.
human beings, and so we relate to the emotion that's being projected. And that's what's important about this conversation. I'm really enjoying this conversation, by the way.
I think it's that authenticity because there's a lot of tools. Like in my industry, we have a lot of tools where I can kind of clone and sample
Hmm.
and take stuff that was created before me, and I could rearrange it in such a way that that was a hit, and I can make it a hit again, kind of living off the what was done in the past and not really creating anything really new. I'm just
Hmm.
moving things around, or I can choose to take the influence of that and actually write something new that comes from the heart. And what I've always, as a music fan and producer, I've always appreciated people who, they might listen to like the great blues people like Led Belly, Robert Johnson, and come up with something like Led Zeppelin. Led Zeppelin used to listen to all those blues guys from the
Hmm.
Delta, and then they came up with this type of rock that was influenced by that, but it wasn't exactly that. And they weren't taking exactly note for note. They came up with something different, just like the Stones took the Delta blues and turned it into this other thing. And it's its own thing. It doesn't sound like the Delta, but it comes from that. And then today we have people who will just clone exactly something,
Yeah,
and
yeah, that's the thing that's like,
it doesn't feel authentic. It doesn't feel like the Stones. It doesn't feel like Led Zeppelin. So you're like,
well, because you want to hear from the artists themselves. Like some of these new, like I know one artist that keeps coming up to mind for me, Kelly Clarkson, like her latest song Me. I listened to it and it was so poetic because for me she was being very vulnerable about
mhm,
her experience. And as a woman, I could relate right away because I've been divorced before and I've been a single mom before. And so I could understand her journey,
mhm,
especially right now. And I appreciate music like that more so than what you're talking about, where they just take an old hit and then just kind of do their own thing with it and then just call it a new thing. I'd rather someone that takes the influence, like you were talking about Led Zeppelin, and actually creating something unique to them, to their gift.
yeah. That to me is like when I've talked to authors, is they kind of have this spark, like they have these ideas and they have the outline, but sometimes they go into like the stream of consciousness where they
Hmm.
just write it down and then they fix it. And
Yeah.
what I found is like with musicians, I was like, I always tell them is like kind of just go with a flow
Hmm.
and then just put it down on tape and then go back and listen to it. But if you keep on starting and stopping and starting and stopping because you're trying to make it perfect, perfection is kind of like the enemy of a lot of, honest, the authenticity.
Hmm.
Because if you spend so much time trying to get the right note, you lose the intention of what was originally done. And it's why I always tell people like if you do a demo and you do like 20 takes and
Hmm.
you go back and listen to the first three are closer to what the original intention was. By the time you
Yeah.
get to the 20th one, you start correcting yourself, you start rewriting it, you start not being as honest, you start changing it. And
You
what
start
ends up happening,
overthinking it.
yeah, then it doesn't sound as good. Now you could not, maybe your mic wasn't as good, maybe you have some mistakes, maybe you hit your belt buckle, but guess what? There are producers and engineers that have taken in the past
Hmm.
not on imperfect recordings, but because though they had so much feel, they chose those takes instead of the ones that were perfect without the outside noise or other things because it was so much better because where the artist was at that moment was so good, and that's why you have people who help make those choices in the arts that like if it's up to the artist sometimes they'll just wreck it, they'll wreck their own work, and you're like, you have to stop that.
No, 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 I get it because I mean, I can totally relate There's a book that I collaborated on not too long ago. It's back in December. A bunch of authors got together and we write and publish your book is the name of the book. And we all wrote about our process about writing and publishing our books, right? To help other authors that had that seed in their mind to write a book, but haven't really taken the plunge to do it, and to give them some strategy. And one of the strategies I talked about was this topic of perfection. It's like the perfection is like certainty. It's an illusion the mind creates to make us feel safe, right? We want, as human beings, we want to control our circumstances a great deal. That's just a pattern of our behavior, that it was developed long, long ago when we were little kids. And like what you said, I actually can totally relate. If you're trying to write a book, to start and stop and start and stop and start and stop, you're losing energy. Number one, you're losing that whole train of thought that's beautiful, that's a download. In my case, there was a download from up above. So you don't want to stop that flow. You just want to write, 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 write. And at the end, either hire someone that can come in as an editor and say, okay, let me help you with this piece.
Mhm.
And you can continue flowing through the other chapters and I'll edit. Or you can put it through other systems and get it edited. Nowadays, there's so many systems on the
Yeah,
computer
yeah,
that you could do, right? Like self do on your own. And I found I work better with editors, but the point being is that really it's about right. It's very accurate. The first 3 takes are the most authentic, the most genuine because they come from the heart. After those 3 takes is when your ego starts to play with you. Like it starts to make you doubt yourself. That wasn't good enough. You need to do it again. That wasn't perfect. You got to do it perfectly. But that's your ego, that's your self-programming coming into play. And so since our title is How to Drop the Ego and Live a Life of Joy,
yeah.
here's
I
one
think,
way to drop the ego is to interrupt that thought because
yeah,
you have conscious ability. That's the subconscious mind basically coming into play.
I think a
Uh,
lot of people do that. I think a lot of people, they say, well, how does that relate to regular life? Like that third, yeah, that multiple take, scenario. People deal with that every day
yeah.
in choices that they make.
Hmm.
And it becomes like, then you have people that say, well, this, you kind of feel it. You get in a room and you feel there's some people like they don't care give across like their authentic self. You feel like they're putting a mask on, they're putting another character on. You can feel it. I'm kind of
Hmm.
like an energy person. I can kind of feel that energy when I see when somebody's kind of coming in and they're showing me this thing. I was like, but that doesn't really feel authentic. It feels kind of
Hmm.
forced. It feels kind of, and I'm like, like you can feel it, and you're like, versus somebody who's more kind of organic, and you're like, yeah, and you have to deal with the consequence of being negative. It might not, they might say something kind of not well thought out, but that's who they are, and it's like that's what it is. Life is messy, so instead of being scared of what you're saying, you kind of be real. It's like when people say they're real or they're not real. But
And give yourself grace, right? Because
yeah, yeah,
when you're trying something new, I think a lot of people put so much pressure on themselves, like to do, like we were talking about, like to do it perfectly. No, it's like little kids. Like give yourself some grace. You're trying something new. It's going to take a couple of takes for you to really master what it is that you're doing, right? It's going to take a lot of failures at times,
yeah.
64 no's to get it
Well, yeah,
right,
there's
right? To
there's
have
nothing
your,
wrong with failure because, like, to me, it's the road to success.
yes,
It's got all
yes.
these turns and twists,
Well,
right?
and it has the lessons learned, right? Because,
Yeah,
and this is something that when I wrote Journey to Me, it was in that reflection piece of like, what was the lesson I learned when I got bullied in high school? What was the lesson I learned when I had this traumatic event happen in my life? And how have I applied that lesson throughout my life? And how has that made my life beautiful and more full of joy? And that's the journey I took you on in Journey to Me, because there was so many lessons learned. You've already learned them, and what's coming down your path, you're going to be able to apply those lessons learned at a much higher level than when you started, like years ago, when you were
mhm,
in fear, when you were journeying through that piece of your life, right? That you're a different person, different identity, if you will. But as you journey through it, you gain that wisdom and you gain that experience, and now you know better, right? We know that perfectionism and certainty after COVID-19 is an illusion. Certainty can be pulled from under us fairly
Yeah.
quickly. And there is no certainty in life, right? So stepping into the unknown, into this big, hairy, black world that sometimes we look at change like that, like, oh, it's so scary. I'm like, no, step in there. Step in there because you might find the biggest joy of your life when you do.
Yeah, I mean, I was a road warrior. I mean, I'm still an IT professional, and I kind of measured like how many airports you've been in, how long you're away from home, and you're doing that job, and it's like after a while, it was like, I don't want the reward points. Like I was just like I wasn't enjoying my home. I was like, I'm doing this job and I'm not at home. And then the COVID came and it kind of changed the whole thing. So I didn't have to do it. And
Uh-huh.
then I could actually do everything here. And it gave me the time where I wasn't in the airport, not in the Uber, not,
Hmm.
in stuck in traffic, where then suddenly I could do my passions. I could do my music more. I can in my home studio, in my bedroom, I can write instead of being in the airport. Um, so then I started to feel like, wow, would I ever really want to go back to that? Like, no, I really don't want to go back to that kind of world where I was doing that because I've been able to do it without doing that. I
Hmm.
think a lot of people found out, at least listen, a software designer, I don't have to do that. I talk to people all over the world. I don't have to be in their office to do that.
No, there's a thing
So
called Zoom.
yeah,
We
so
we
why do I
found
have to
that
be
one
on?
out.
I don't have to be on the plane, but there was people who felt like, oh, you really have to be there. You have to, and it was like, no, like you don't. It was like a certain expectation. They were kind of setting the rules and saying you had to do that, and then people was like, well, because of COVID, now we can't. So what are you going to do? You got to do something else. So
It helped us think outside the box, didn't it? Because we were all living in a box. A lot of us were, right? We conform ourselves to these boxes because they're safe. And if we step out of that box, well, there's that big hairy world again that might scare us to death, or it could give us the greatest joy we've ever known.
yeah,
All
you just
right.
start to feel
It's
that you can be your own person,
Yeah,
right? If you
yeah.
have more time and you're not that time's not being taken by somebody else's agenda or somebody else's expectations. Now you have time to be creative as a human being. And you can go and do what be an author, you can be a writer, you can be a speaker, you can be a life coach, shaman, you can do whatever. You can choose to do what you were supposed to do, right?
Hmm.
And not what the corporate world says that's the measure that you need to get seven figures and have your stock bonus and do this and do that. But it wasn't making you happy. You're going to the psychologist and you're like, hey, I got my Lexus, I got this, but I'm not happy. Why aren't you happy? Because you're not really doing what you want.
Well, and you made a very good point. Uh, Outside things, while they're beautiful, like Alexis, they're not going to give you the happiness you're seeking because the happiness exists inside of you. And that was a lesson that took me almost 40 years to learn, because I'm almost nearing 50 and I've learned a lot since that near death experience that really happiness starts with you and it starts by loving yourself the way that God loves you.
Mhm.
From that, for me, that's the definition of self love. Love myself the way that God loves me, see myself the way He sees me, which is perfect in His way, right? Built perfectly in His image. I didn't see myself like that. I saw myself as broken before the near
Mhm.
death and even after the near death, because it still takes time for the mind to catch up, right? Because it's been programmed so um, much to believe certain aspects of ourselves. They're lies that we believe for a long time, but we don't know they're lies at the time. We think
Mhm.
they're truths, right? Until we start to really take these deep dives into our subconscious and understanding why we believe what we believe. And when we finally realize and see the truth, there's no going back after that. Once you start to really understand the concept of self-love and understand the concept of your light and the purpose of why you're here on earth, and you start aligning everything to that purpose, life seems very different after that. And nothing outside of myself now can give me as much pleasure and love as the things on the inside of me, the love and the foundation I've built within that gives me that sense of satisfaction. That's why a lot of people, they'll strive, and they'll get there, this magical place they've built up in their head that is going to give them this big pot of gold, big pot of happiness, and then they get there, and then they realize, no, it's not there. Where
You
is
gotta
it?
find, yeah, you
Well,
gotta
where
find
is
the
it?
next thing. They're
The
looking
next
for the
thing,
next thing.
and the
Yeah,
next
'cause
thing, and
yeah.
and they never stop to
Find it.
enjoy the moments
Yeah.
because they're little. These moments are very small in life. I had a moment with my parents, like as my son was graduating from high school about a month ago, that I will forever treasure that moment. My dad is, they're older now, they're in their 80s, and he struggles to walk, so he was in his wheelchair, right? And they wanted to buy this gift for my son, right, for graduation. So I took him to the mall, and then I said, you know what? Let's have a margarita. It was just the three of us, my
Mhm.
parents and I, and we sat down in the middle of the mall and had a margarita. And it was like the most awesome moment. But
Just
had I
like,
been like in this state of having to achieve, I would have missed that moment entirely. It would have been something I had to do with my parents, if that makes
yeah,
any sense to you.
yeah,
And
just kinda
now it's like, yeah,
random
this
moments of joy, that happen sometimes unplanned,
unplanned, totally unplanned, and they become the best moments
Yeah, I
in
mean,
your
I like to just go off for walks in the woods, like, 'cause I live in New Hampshire,
Oh,
and
that's awesome. I love New Hampshire. We were there last year.
so what I do is, like, I'll be in my home studio and you kinda get into your man cave type of thing, on my studio
Mhm.
cave,
Uh-huh.
and you can get lost in all the stuff, right? So
Mhm.
you lost in your piano, lost in the sounds, your guitar, and then sometimes you have to walk away. And being in New Hampshire, it's really great because it's not like a city. You're like, okay, I'll just go in the woods. I just go for a hike in the woods. I'll jump on my mountain bike, jump in a canoe, and go down a river, and then that totally like revitalizes you because I always felt there's this poem called like the the cathedral is nature. It's
Mhm.
like I think Longfellow or Hawthorne, and they took this idea that nature can revitalize you because it's like got this spiritual power that's equal to any kind of religion. That you just walking in nature is the cathedral. And
Mhm.
if you get out there and you don't put your headphones on, you actually listen to the woods, you listen to the river, you listen to the animals. It actually will, lower your blood pressure, get your breathing right, put your head if you're all stressed out. It just evens me out. I was like, that to me, it's like therapy. It's like the best thing. It's free. It doesn't cost any
Mhm.
money. I just walk in the woods. The woods like 5 minutes from my house. I just go into the trail, and I just it doesn't cost money to do that.
No. No.
you know.
No, just go. We were walking, we were on a trip because we took our son to England and Scotland for his graduation present, and we were walking. We went to, Edinburgh, and we went to the botanical gardens, and the minute we stepped foot in there, it was so magical. It was just flowers all around
Hmm.
us, the royal gardens or whatever, and your blood pressure drops significantly because you feel at peace. Even my husband said it, like, "Oh my gosh, I bet if you took my blood pressure right now, it'd be so low." And I'm like, "Yeah, probably. Not so low to where you would pass out, but low
Yeah.
enough." Uh, and it was just smelling the flowers. And it sounds so like some people would say, "Oh my gosh, this I can't relate to this." But when you've journeyed so much in that perfectionist world, and you have had your energy depleted so much, and you've had a lack of joy in your life, that gives you such contrast, doesn't it, to the
Mhm.
life that you live now, where you go on your trails and you take a moment and center yourself and stay in the now. Forget the past, forget the future. You're right there in the now with nature. That's the best time, because that is a moment of joy that you're going to savor, and it's going to ground you, and it's going to keep you present. So, to receive whatever it is that you're about to receive, The person I am today versus the person I once was are like two different, like ego and joy. Totally
Mhm.
different
Yeah.
personalities, totally different identities. And these two identities I talk a lot about in Journey to Me. It's the identity we've been talking about a lot is the ego identity, the one that's striving, this perfectionist, high achiever, based on these limiting beliefs. And the joyful, the soul identity is the joyful side, the side you were authentically created to be. And they're always battling it out in your life. And sometimes, more than likely, ego wins a lot of times, unfortunately.
Mhm.
Um, but I find that the more I interrupt the ego, the more soul wins.
Yeah. I
But it's
feel like, yeah, I mean, the inner source of wisdom for me is always like, nature or it's like music. And it's a combination because I kind of hear music and everything. So if I go out and I listen to the birds and the squirrels, it's like I hear music in the river, and
hmm
I'll actually go out and I'll record it. I'll do field recordings in the woods and like bring them into my music, like Yes and used to do. Like progressive rock bands used to actually go out in the woods and record the woods and then bring
Oh,
it into their music. And it was kind of revolutionary, the idea that you could do that, because it's like, yeah, well, that's music. Like what you
hmm
hear out in the world, the field recordings, like what you just hear, just the wind or the waves crashing on different bodies of water, and like listening to that and hearing what it does. People actually pay for ambient music to fall asleep that has stuff like that. Um, and you're like, yeah, because it has a lot of power to just kind of make you feel like this wisdom that kind of comes over you if you're not trying to overthink it. If you just let it come into you, if you
yeah.
like receive what is around you instead of trying to control what's
hmm
around you. And that's the difference. Like as a musician, a lot of times nowadays I try to just kind of this like the muse is out there and I'll just like jump on my piano and just like I'm just gonna let it come through my fingers and not try to think about what it is and just let it be.
Yeah,
Kind of like the
allowing
Beatles.
just
Yeah, the
or,
Beatles, like, let it
you know,
be.
and I it brings me back to something that happened during the writing of Journey to Me. One point I got stuck, like really stuck in the middle of the project, and I didn't know what to write about next. And I asked God, I said, "Well, this is your gig. You've had me write this book, so I need your help." And I just allowed, I sat in that silence, which was a bit hard for someone like me who is very chatty to
Mhm,
sit in that silence and be still, right? Um, but I did. And then all of a sudden, one day on a walk, because this happened during 2020 when the book was written in nature, and all of a sudden the download came. And I luckily had a notebook and a pencil, which I would recommend for any authors listening, any artists listening. Always have a notebook and pencil with you because the downloads come at such odd times and you got to be ready. And so I just
yep,
started to write and it just started to flow again. But at times you will find those blockages that we call in coaching. There's blockages out there. One way to remove those blockages is to declutter the mind, because the mind is like it's just too much thoughts going through it. So I know when people are listening, they want to know, well, what can I do if I have just I'm too overwhelmed, if you will.
mhm,
There's lots of ways to get rid of that overwhelm. Some people use exercise, some people use prayer, meditation. I use writing to just declutter. I just declutter my mind of whatever's in my head. And I just in a notebook with pencil and I just start writing whatever's coming to me to declutter. And what I do also is meditation. And I've done meditation since 2020. And some people are like, I just can't sit still. I don't know how to do this. And so I just tell them, it's like, it doesn't even have to be for that long. It can
yeah,
just be for a minute. You just have to build the habit because your mind just needs structure, right? A little bit of structure. So just start with a minute if you can't sit still. Um, and start there and just progressively move up. When you master the 1 minute, move up to 5 minutes or four or three or whatever works for you, and build from that. Because the more you do that consistently, the more you're in the now as opposed
mhm.
to in the past or in the future.
Yeah,
And in the now is where you create. That's where your creation really occurs, is in the present moment.
Yeah, I mean, I practice a Buddhism that we actually do a chanting kind of meditation, and
Hmm.
it's a daily kind of affirmation type of thing where you actually you kind of speak out what you believe,
Hmm.
and you make it, what's inside you bring out, but you also kind of do a breathing exercise, and it's kind of like Tai Chi in a way. It's a form of Japanese Buddhism, Nichiren Daishonin Buddhism, but it's old, but it's just what it does, it just centers you, it calms you down. It's kind of like walking in the woods,
Hmm.
and it just gets your breathing right, it gets your mind right. You don't get anxious anymore. You just kind of allows you to just get a hold of those random thoughts and get things kind of in a level plane, like plane. And I just find that doing that, music does almost the same thing. And I kind of fell into it because I felt like when I jump on a piano, I kind of get in the zone. If
Oh
I
yeah.
jump, yeah, if I start playing my piano, I end up playing it for like 2 hours. I didn't even know I was doing it, and it makes me feel good. I can't really worry when I'm playing my piano. And I would think if you talk to a lot of musicians, whatever instrument they're on, once they're on it, they're not really worrying about anything when they're playing. It actually just is like a very cathartic. And
Hmm.
so if people can find the thing that is cathartic for them,
And
whatever,
that's whatever
yeah,
that is. Like, and I also play the piano, and for a long time I used it as my go-to to just relax, because you're not thinking, you're right. You're just being, you're enjoying. That's what it is. And for me, music is the same way. If I'm very altered, like if something really bothered me or what have you, at times to interrupt those thoughts from really becoming these big, massive feelings, I will play music. I will play music and I will get back into that joyful state, because there's always choices that you make in life, whether you realize it or not, you're making a choice, and I this is something I've shared with my family, I've shared with in the book, but at the end of every week, I used to be this really negative person. I used to always be focused on the negative, and everything was happening to me instead of for me. And so one strategy I used for myself that really helped me move past that and shift over to the side of like joy was, at the end of every week I would write down all the things, all the beautiful things that I got to do, and all the negative things that had happened. Any fights with my husband, fights with the kids, or anything like that, I would just release it to God, right? To my higher source, right? And that's different for everybody. So whoever that is for you, or whatever that is for you, release it to that, and just let it go. Completely let it go. And I found that that was very, very beneficial, because it allowed my mind to focus on all the blessings I was given throughout the week. And there's so many. And
yeah,
there are so many blessings. We miss them though sometimes because we're so focused on what we didn't get,
yeah, that's the
and
problem.
that's where I think most people get stuck.
They get stuck on the things that they wanted that they didn't get, or the
Mhm.
expectations that they had that they didn't meet, and don't actually, and they kind of spend them too much time being hard on yourself for the things that you think you failed at, where
Yeah,
you're not really uh, patting yourself on the back for the things that you actually succeeded at. You know,
yeah, like, and there's small wins. I always,
yeah, small wins all the time, and
I
people don't count them.
no, they don't, because the mind is so intent on the negative. That's why in your chanting, you're probably affirming, you're using I am statements, and you're affirming, hey, I am this person. Because if you say I am not, or I'm not, the mind will focus in on the not piece. And that's where people get stuck, right? I've
Yeah,
gotten stuck there
yeah.
numerous times. That's why I recognize it very quickly in others, and I know that journey. I know what it feels like to be there. Um, but you don't have to. You really don't have to. You can choose joy at any moment in your life.
Well, I want to let people know we have your LinkedIn up, and if people that will be fully clickable when we actually are published. So, one of the things on the podcast, we do encourage the audience to actually click on the links on the different platforms that we're on. We're on most platforms where you can watch or listen to podcasts. Right now,
Mhm.
we're on Facebook and YouTube and Twitch live, and those will be clickable once we're fully published, and that'll bring you right to the LinkedIn. So if somebody goes to your LinkedIn, they can connect with you.
Yes, they can. It's totally open. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Instagram as at Coach Sylvia Worsham. So you're welcome to connect with me at any of those platforms. And the only platform I'm not on just yet is TikTok,
Hmm.
but
Yeah,
I'm
it's the
on
hard one.
Clubhouse and Facebook and Business Facebook, all of that at Coach Sylvia Worsham. That's usually how you'll find me. And so if you're not on LinkedIn, if you say you're not a professional, which is what the professional webpage is for LinkedIn, then Facebook, you can always find me there. And I'll be willing to answer any questions on anything that came up during this interview or beyond. So.
That's always awesome, to have that further dive. And I always encourage people who listen or watch the podcast to do do check out the links, because then you can connect to the guests that we have on the show, and get, if you're interested in the things we've talked about, you can follow up with Sylvia, and that's always a cool thing. That's why we do the podcast, because it's a long form. We introduce you to our audience, and people, get to know who you are from this more than 15-second thing that today people don't really get to do what we do with the podcast. We try to give you a little bit more than what you get in
Mhm.
a normal social media. With like the 30-second,
Yeah.
90-second reel doesn't really show you who somebody is, but hopefully tonight you've gotten a good picture of your approach, and we appreciate you being a guest on the Family Like to Ghost podcast.
It was a pleasure being here. I really, truly, truly enjoyed our conversation. It was very inspiring.
Thank you very much, and have a great night.
You too.